Hey everyone, I'm Elisa, and this time we're going to go over the respiratory system. So we're going to start with part one, the introduction to the respiratory system. Things that it does, the functions of the respiratory system. It's primarily to facilitate the process of breathing, which does a few things actually, and we're going to go over some of those um, levels of complexity. Ventilation refers to with the bringing in and the pushing out of air using the lungs specifically as like kind of the major movers. We'll talk about the idea of respiration. So, like when we talk about respiration with the respiratory system, that's when we're talking about lungs. However, there is also a respiration that is part of cellular metabolism. And the reason is because it uses oxygen as that terminal electron acceptor of the electron transport chain, right? And so that's how those two are like interlinked together. Okay, we're going to be looking at like macro scale respiration. So the pulling in of that oxygen into the organism, into the animals. In this case, humans are the animals. Sorry, biologists. You know how we are. Okay, so the functions include what we call the gas exchange. So also part of cellular metabolism oftentimes is what we're dealing with the breaking down of glucose. And that means we're going to be breaking apart some carbon chains. And so that means we're going to be also needing to get rid of some carbon dioxide, right? Which is one of those byproducts of getting that energy out of sugars, okay? And we use oxygen, which is the input to do that. Or we use oxygen, which is the input to run the electron transport chain, which gives us all that ATP, okay? So you'll want to be thinking of the lungs as pulling in oxygen and taking out carbon dioxide, pushing that back into the outside world. We also use it for some other stuff, communicating, right? So we use that air as it runs over our larynx or our nose or our mouth and whatnot in order to produce speech as well as some other vocalizations. We also use the respiratory system so we can pull in um, aerosolized elements from our environment and use our chemoreceptors in our sense of smell or olfaction to kind of learn a little bit about what's around us. Also, we're going to be dealing with being able to modify the pH of the body, especially because of the presence or absence of carbon dioxide. Okay. So the anatomy of the respiratory system itself, we have a couple of different zones and we have some different tracks. Primarily, we're going to start over um, the respiratory zone of the respiratory system is pretty much going to be wherever we're facilitating this gas exchange. And there's these little tiny within the lungs, right? Here's like my lungs that I'm going to draw for you because I'm an artist. Inside the lungs, we have all of this alveoli, which really looks like little bits of grapes, right? And these are at the end of the smallest little tubes that are going to bring in air, oxygen, or help us remove carbon dioxide. And so that's the site of a lot of our gas exchange. The upper respiratory tract is everything from like the head all the way through the larynx. Okay, so we were talking about vocalizations, olfaction, right? The sensing of smell. Um, all of that good stuff. Also, we'll be looking at the lower respiratory tract. So those are going to be the organs that kind of like are below the larynx itself. So we're going down into the thoracic region of the body. So generally trachea through the lungs. We'll show you a picture here. So here we have the larynx, which is really like the cutoff point. Okay, so this is the upper respiratory system, and this is the lower respiratory system. So we have key elements such as the parts of the nose. So for the nose, parts of the nose, we'll be looking at the intake of the nasal cavity. It's nice and folded right in this area. Lots of ridged, highly vascularized, lots of olfactory um, sensation going on in this area. So lots of chemoreception. The nostril is the point of entry. And let's see here. The other part, so here's posterior nasal aperture. So this is really where we're actually connecting in with, let me see if I can just make that a little bit bigger. Yeah, okay. Where we connect in with the mouth and start beginning to meet going down the pharynx itself. So like the pharynx, well, let me see if I can get, let me just, bloop. Okay. So here's where the nose kind of ends and dumps out into the pharynx. Let me see, where is it? Right, pharynx right here. And that's like really this entire area, like right as we're kind of getting down. And then here is the mouth, right? So you can also breathe through your mouth. You bring that in also to the pharynx. So the thing is that this is all like kind of a connected region. The epiglottis is going to prevent food particles from going down into the trachea, and the trachea is going to lead, right? So here we would be going down to the stomach if we were going down this way through the esophagus. But if the epiglottis opens that little trap door and we go in here, this is the trachea. And the trachea is this like, it has these rings, like these little ridged rings of cartilage and connective tissue here. So it gives it some flexibility, but also keeps that airway like physically like propped open with those rings. Also the larynx, which we'll look at a little bit more. So that has a series of little connective tissues, which as we expand them or contract them, like making the airway larger or smaller, can kind of change our voice from going up high to low, some other items. Okay. So let me see if I can drag the lower rest. There it is. Okay. The lower respiratory system, characterized primarily by the presence of these big old things. These are the lungs. So the lungs are kind of neat. They are actually float or air bladders back from when we were fish that have been modified now to perform that gas exchange function. So the trachea is the main tube, which we discussed, like this is where the pharynx is going to meet the trachea, and it's going to move down and divide into two, like it branches off into the bronchi, right? So it has the where are you going? You stay right. You just go right there. Okay. So these are the bronchi, right? So those are the bronchial tubes. If you have inflammation of these tubes, you have bronchitis, right? So the itis is the inflammation of those. So some of you have had that before. Um, so individually, they are known as the bronchus, right? So here's the left main bronchus over here, and then this would be like the right main bronchus over here, and it like further subdivides and subdivides out into smaller and smaller tubules until finally they're like all throughout the lungs. And so the other thing to notice about the lungs that is kind of interesting is that the lungs are lobular, meaning there are lobes, right? So they're not symmetrical in that way. In like, so on this side, on the right lung, the right side has three lobes, and then the left side is a little bit different. Okay, so it has some features that are kind of important. Number one, the left side has two lobes, and then it also has this little like, here's the heart, cardiac notch right here, and it's this little dip that is like the heart kind of is pushed into on the left side of the lungs. Right. Okay. And so some of the other things to think about here, hold on, let me clear those pin markings. Okay. So some of the other things is this idea of the plural, right? So the pleura means like more than one, right? And so since you have two lungs, it's like you have more than one. That's really where the pleura come from. So the pleural cavity refers to the space that the lungs are occupying, and the pleura specifically is this like double layer, right? So it's a double layer, and then on the of like bag that surrounds it, you can kind of see here, and then on the inside of it is serous fluid, right? And what that does, the serosa, this fluid that's filling the inside of these like bags, right? These serosa fluid. Oops, there it is. What this is doing is it's creating a friction barrier because as you remember, like the lungs are going to expand and then they're going to contract, right? So they're going to rub and roll around the inside part of the cavity, and they're rolling around inside of, a place where there is the heart and these major blood vessels. And what you don't want is you don't want friction, right? Because that could tear these tissues and make them really kind of, destroyed. So that's one of the things that it does. Then down here, this is an important one. This is this really strange muscle. It is a skeletal muscle, and it is known as the diaphragm. And here's this little cutout right here, like where there's a cutout where things can go through. But for the most part, it's like this giant plate, and it spans the entire inside bottom of the thoracic cavity. And if it contracts, it helps it contract and relaxing of the diaphragm muscle actually squishes the bottom of the lungs to either, expel air or allows them to kind of open up and take in more air. So that's what the function of the diaphragm is. Like the lungs are kind of this like late addition to human evolution. Not human evolution, I shouldn't say that. Evolution in animals generally, right? So we had things down for a long time. Like number one, like we were really good at digestive. That's an oldie and an important one, okay? Two, like after a while, eventually, when we got bigger, we went from a open circulatory system to a closed one, right? So it became like a true circulatory system in the way that we understand. And so, like, relatively recently, have we pulled in this like lungs? We've converted these swim bladders, and so like it's not the best system evolution wise. Um, so much later evolves the respiratory system. And that's apparent in a lot of things, like in development, children are not born with fully developed respiratory system. It takes until they are, probably towards the end of elementary school before they're really um, finished developing it, which is one of the reasons why, smoking and vaping and having different things around them is really important not to do that in their younger years. Okay. Um, okay, so this is the respiratory system. Here he is. And I hope that was helpful. And right, I will see you very soon in part two. Okay, have a great night.